He didn't leave John Deere because they wronged him. He left because he saw something coming that nobody else in Champaign County was looking for yet. 3 years later, the dealership he walked away from drove to his farm, not to apologize, but because his fields were producing numbers they couldn't explain. It was a Thursday morning in January of 2019, and Gerald Crouch was sitting at the desk in the small office off his equipment shed where he did the reading that he considered as essential to farming as anything he did in the field itself, reading that his son Aaron had been teasing him about since Aaron was old enough to understand that most farmers in Champaign County, Illinois, did not spend their January mornings working through agricultural technology journals and equipment manufacturer financial reports and university extension research publications the way other men worked through the morning paper. And Gerald was reading a John Deere investor relations document that he had downloaded from the company's website the previous evening, a document whose primary audience was institutional investors and financial analysts, and that had therefore been written with the specific candor that companies reserve for the people whose continued investment they depend on, and withhold from the customers whose continued loyalty they prefer to manage through marketing rather than transparency. And the candor in the investor relations document was saying something about John Deere's strategic direction over the coming 5 years that Gerald had been assembling from fragments across 18 months of reading, and that was now, in this document, stated with sufficient completeness that the fragments assembled themselves into a picture Gerald could see clearly and evaluate honestly against the specific needs of his 480-acre operation outside Urbana. What the picture showed was not malfeasance and not deception, but strategy, legitimate corporate strategy of the kind that large equipment manufacturers pursue when they have identified a direction that serves their long-term financial interests and are committing their development resources accordingly. And the strategy John Deere's investor relations document described was the full integration of their equipment platform into a proprietary data and service ecosystem that would, within the 5-year horizon the document outlined, make every new John Deere machine purchased after a certain point dependent on John Deere's own data infrastructure for its optimal performance. Dependent not in the mechanical sense that a machine depends on fuel and maintenance, but in the operational sense that a precision agriculture operation depends on data, on the yield mapping and the soil variability analysis and the application rate optimization that modern farming at Gerald's scale required to produce the margins that kept a 480-acre operation viable in Champaign County, Illinois, where land costs and input costs and the competition from larger operations created a margin environment that punished inefficiency with the specific mercilessness of markets that have no interest in the reasons inefficiency occurs, only in its consequences. Gerald had 3 John Deere machines in his equipment shed in January of 2019, a 2016 8370R tractor that he had paid $340,000 for and that represented the operational centerpiece of his farming year, a 2014 utility tractor that handled the secondary work of the operation with the reliable competence of a machine that has been correctly matched to its task, and a 2017 S780 combine that Aaron ran during harvest with the focused efficiency of a young man who has grown up around equipment and developed the specific mechanical fluency that growing up around equipment produces when the young man in question has his father's attention to detail and his own instinct for the operational feel of a machine under load. And the 3 machines were good machines, genuinely good. And Gerald had no complaint about any of them as machines, had maintained them with the thoroughness that his operational philosophy required, and had received from them the performance that good maintenance and correct operation produce. And none of that was what the investor relations document was about, and none of it was what Gerald was evaluating on the Thursday morning in January when he finished reading the document and set it on the desk beside the 18 months of fragments it had finally completed, and looked at the assembled picture and began the accounting that the picture required. Aaron came into the office at 9:30 with 2 coffee cups and found his father at the desk with a legal pad covered in the precise small handwriting that Gerald used for calculations he was working through in real time, and Aaron set a coffee cup beside the legal pad and looked at the numbers on it and said, "What are you working on?" And Gerald said, "Equipment decision." And Aaron said, "What equipment decision?" And Gerald said, "Whether to stay with John Deere or switch the operation to Case IH." And Aaron looked at his father and then at the legal pad and said, "We just bought the S780 2 years ago." And Gerald said, "I know." And Aaron said, "And the 8370R 3 years before that." And Gerald said, "I know, Aaron." And Aaron said, "So what's the decision?" And Gerald turned the legal pad toward his son and said, "Read the numbers in the third column." And Aaron read them and said, "What are these?" And Gerald said, "Projected operational cost differential over a 7-year equipment ownership period under John Deere's current strategic direction versus an alternative platform." And Aaron said, "Where are you getting the John Deere projection from?" And Gerald said, "From John Deere." And Aaron said, "John Deere told you this?" And Gerald said, "John Deere told their investors this, which is a more reliable source than anything they would tell us." And Aaron looked at the numbers in the third column and looked at his father and said, "This is a significant difference." And Gerald said, "Yes, it is." And Aaron said, "You've been working on this for a while." And Gerald said, 18 months. And Aaron said, "And you're ready to decide?" And Gerald said, "I've been ready since November. I wanted to finish the investor document before I moved." And Aaron said, "What does Case IH look like?" And Gerald said, "I've been talking to Walt Higgins since October." And Aaron said, "Walt knows?" And Gerald said, "Walt knows I'm serious." And Aaron said, "What about Lester?" And Gerald looked at his son and said, "What about Lester?" And Aaron said, "Lester Dunn has been buying John Deere from Stan Merritt's dealership for 30 years, and he's going to have opinions about this." And Gerald said, "Lester is welcome to his opinions, Aaron. I'm doing an accounting, not a survey." And Aaron picked up his coffee cup and looked at the legal pad one more time and said, "When?" And Gerald said, "The 8370R goes first. I've already called the equipment dealer in Champaign. They'll take it on consignment starting February 1st. And Aaron said nothing for a moment, and then said, "All right." And that single word, delivered without drama and without resistance, was the entirety of Aaron Crouch's response to the information that the farming operation he had grown up in and was building his adult life around was about to remove every piece of equipment his father had spent 6 years acquiring and replace it with machines neither of them had ever run, which told Gerald everything he needed to know about the son he had raised, which was that Aaron trusted the accounting the way Gerald trusted the accounting, not blindly and not without question, but with the specific confidence of a person who has watched careful thinking produce correct outcomes often enough to extend it the benefit of the doubt when the outcome was not yet visible. The 8370R left on February 14, 2019, loaded onto the equipment dealer's trailer in the early morning while the Champaign County fields were still carrying the gray stillness of a Midwest February, and Gerald watched it go from the equipment shed doorway with the specific expression of a man watching something leave that he has already fully accounted for and therefore does not need to mourn. The expression that Aaron had seen on his father's face in other versions throughout his 29 years, and that he had learned to read correctly as not coldness but completion, the look of a man for whom a decision fully made requires no emotional processing beyond the making of it, and the equipment shed bay that the 8370R left empty was filled on March 2nd by a 2019 Case IH Magnum 380 that Walt Higgins delivered personally, which was not standard dealer procedure and which Gerald understood as Walt's way of communicating the seriousness with which he was taking the relationship.
And Walt walked Gerald and Aaron through the machine with the thorough professionalism of a dealer who knows his equipment completely and respects the customer enough to assume they want the complete knowledge rather than the sales version of it. And Gerald asked the questions he had prepared across the weeks of research that had preceded the purchase, specific technical questions about the machine's data architecture and its third-party diagnostic compatibility and its software update protocols, questions that Walt answered with the directness of a man who has nothing to hide about the product he is selling. And Aaron watched his father and Walt work through the technical specifications with the focused attention of a young farmer absorbing information he understood was going to matter in ways that the morning's delivery context did not fully reveal. The utility tractor went in March, and the replacement arrived in April, and the S780 combine was the last to go, sold in late April to an operation in Vermilion County that had been looking for a late-model S-Series machine, and that paid a price Gerald considered fair against the depreciation schedule he had run in January. And the Case IH combine that replaced it arrived in the first week of May, and by May 15th of 2019, Gerald Crouch's equipment shed contained no John Deere machines for the first time in 22 years, and the transition that had begun as numbers on a legal pad in January had completed itself in the physical reality of an equipment shed whose green and yellow had been replaced by red and black. And Gerald looked at the shed on the evening of May 15th with the same expression he had worn when the 837R left in February, complete and forward-facing and without the backward pull of regret, and went inside and told Marin the transition was done. And Marin said, "How does it feel?" And Gerald said, "Like a correct decision," which was the highest category of evaluation Gerald Crouch's accounting system produced, and which Marin had learned across 34 years of marriage was both the most Gerald would say about a decision he was confident in and the most that needed to be said. Lester Dunn came over on a Saturday morning in late May with the specific energy of a neighbor who has been holding a question for 3 months and has finally decided that the question deserves a direct answer from the person who can give it. And Lester was 66 years old and had farmed 520 acres adjacent to Gerald's north and west fence lines for 38 years and had bought John Deere equipment from Stan Merritt's dealership his entire farming life and considered the relationship between a serious farmer and his equipment brand to be the kind of long-term commitment that was not abandoned lightly or for reasons that a Saturday morning conversation could not address. And Lester sat at Gerald's kitchen table and said, "Gerald, I've been watching equipment come and go from your shed since February, and I want to understand what you're doing." And Gerald said, "I switched to Case IH." And Lester said, "I can see that. I want to know why." And Gerald got up and went to his office and came back with the legal pad from January and the investor relations document and 3 of the 18 months of supporting materials and set them on the table in front of Lester and said, "Start with the 3rd column on the legal pad and then read the investor document." And Lester looked at the stack of documents and looked at Gerald and said, "You want me to read all of this?" And Gerald said, "I want you to read what supports the numbers in the 3rd column. The rest is context." And Lester read for 40 minutes at Gerald's kitchen table with the focused attention of a farmer reading something that has direct implications for his own operation. And when he finished, he said, "This is John Deere's own document." And Gerald said, "From their investor relations website." And Lester said, "And the numbers in the 3rd column?" And Gerald said, "Are the operational cost implications of the strategic direction the document describes applied to a farming operation our size over a 7-year ownership period?" And Lester said, "This is a significant difference." And Gerald said Aaron said the same thing. And Lester said, "Why didn't you tell me about this before you switched?" And Gerald said, "Lester, you've been buying John Deere from Stan Merritt for 38 years. It wasn't my place to tell you what to do with your equipment decisions before you asked me." And Lester said, "I'm asking you now." And Gerald said, "Now I'm showing you." And Lester sat with the documents for another few minutes and then said, "What does Walt Hidgens say about his data architecture?" And Gerald said, "Walt's platform is open third-party compatible. Your independent mechanic can access the full diagnostic system. Your agronomist can integrate directly with the yield mapping without a John Deere subscription." And Lester said, "And the performance." And Gerald said, "Come back in October after harvest, and I'll show you the yield maps." And Lester said, "I'll be here in October," and picked up his hat and went home. And Gerald cleared the documents from the table and went back to his equipment shed and started his Case IH Magnum and went to work on his fields the way he went to work every day, without announcement and without expectation, just the work and the accounting behind it and the 7-year horizon that the January legal pad had established as the frame within which the decision would prove itself or not prove itself on the honest terms that Gerald Crouch's accounting had always required of every decision he made on his 480 acres outside Urbana.
The first harvest with the Case IH equipment ran from late September through the second week of October 2019, and Gerald and Aaron worked the 480 acres with the specific, focused attention of two people operating unfamiliar equipment on familiar ground, which requires a different kind of attention than operating familiar equipment on familiar ground, because the ground is known and the machine is not, and the relationship between the two has to be built from the beginning, the way all relationships between a farmer and a machine are built, through the accumulation of operational hours that teach a man where his equipment is strong and where it is particular and what it needs from the person running it to perform at the level the specifications promise. And Gerald approached the building of that relationship the way he approached everything, methodically and without rushing his conclusions, running the combine through the first fields at the conservative settings that Walt Higgins had recommended for initial operation and adjusting incrementally as the machine's character revealed itself through performance. And Aaron ran the Magnum with the same patient methodology, and by the end of the first week, both of them had the beginning of the operational knowledge that would deepen across the following seasons into the kind of intimate familiarity that transforms a machine from equipment into an extension of the farmer's understanding of his ground. And the yield maps that the Case IH data system produced from the first harvest were good maps, detailed and accurate, and generated without the subscription architecture that Gerald's January accounting had identified as the coming cost differential, accessible in full through Walt Higgins' open platform integration and through the independent agronomist Gerald had been working with for 11 years, who connected to the new system in 20 minutes and said, "Gerald, this data is cleaner than what we were getting from the John Deere platform." And Gerald said, "I know." And the agronomist said, "How?" And Gerald said, "The integration isn't filtered through a proprietary layer. You're getting the raw sensor output." And the agronomist said, "That's going to change how we build the application maps." And Gerald said, "That's why I switched." And the agronomist looked at him and then at the yield data on his laptop and said nothing further, because the data was saying it more clearly than any conversation could. Lester Dunn came back in October as he had said he would, and Gerald walked him through the yield maps and the operational cost records from the first season and the data integration setup with the agronomist.
And Lester looked at everything with the thorough attention of a man who made the October trip because he intended to evaluate what he found and not merely observe it. And when Gerald finished, Lester said, "Your yield average." And Gerald said 218.4 bushels per acre across the full 480. And Lester said, "Your 2018 average with the John Deere equipment was," and Gerald said 211.7. And Lester said 6.7 bushels per acre improvement in the first season with new equipment on the same ground. And Gerald said, "The yield improvement is not primarily the equipment, Lester. It's the data quality. The agronomist built application maps this fall that he couldn't build with the filtered data we were getting before." And Lester said, "Because the integration is open." And Gerald said, "Because the integration is open." And Lester looked at the yield maps for a long time and said, "I'm going to talk to Walt Higgins." And Gerald said, "Tell him I sent you." And Lester went home and called Walt Higgins the following Monday and began the conversation that ended 18 months later with Lester Dunn's John Deere equipment leaving his farm in the same direction Gerald's had left in the spring of 2019. And Lester was the third farmer in Champaign County to make that transition because Gerald had shown the January legal pad and the investor relations document to two other neighboring farmers between May and October of 2019 when they asked him directly why he had switched. And both of them had read the documents with the same focused attention Lester had brought to them and had arrived at conclusions that their own accountings supported. And the pattern that was establishing itself in Champaign County in the fall and winter of 2019 was the same kind of pattern that Preston Hale's compliance inquiry had established in Tippecanoe County and that Clifton Ward's 11 conversations had established in Pike County, a pattern built on trust and honest accounting rather than complaint or campaign, moving through the existing relationships of a farming community along the paths that genuine credibility travels, which are slower than social media and more durable than any protest, and entirely invisible to the company whose strategic decisions had set them in motion. Stan Merritt noticed the pattern in his dealership's numbers in the spring of 2020, noticed it the way dealers notice things that affect their numbers, which is with the specific alarm of a businessman watching revenue leave in a direction he cannot immediately explain. and Stan's initial explanation was the one that businessmen reach for first when customers leave, which was competitive pricing, and he spent the spring of 2020 reviewing his pricing structure against Walt Higgins and finding that his prices were competitive and that competitive pricing was therefore not the explanation. And then he looked at service and found his service metrics comparable to the county average, and service was therefore not the explanation. And then he looked at the customer accounts that had defected and found that they were clustered in the southern part of the county, in the area around Gerald Crouch's farm, and that the defection timeline started in the spring of 2019, which was when Gerald's equipment transition had completed itself. And Stan looked at the cluster and the timeline and understood that he was looking at a pattern with a center, and that the center was Gerald Crouch's 480-acre operation outside Urbana. And Stan picked up the phone and called Gerald in April of 2020, and Gerald answered, and Stan said, "Gerald, this is Stan Merritt." And Gerald said, "Hello, Stan." And Stan said, "I'd like to talk to you about your equipment decision last year." And Gerald said, "I'm happy to talk, Stan." And Stan said, "I was thinking I could come out to the farm." And Gerald said, "I'm available Thursday morning." And Stan said, "I'll be there at 9, and hung up and sat in his dealership office and looked at the customer defection map on his computer screen with the expression of a man who has identified the center of a pattern and has made an appointment to go there and is now thinking carefully about what he is going to say when he arrives. And what Stan was going to say when he arrived was the question that Gerald was also thinking about on the other end of the conversation, thinking about it with the same analytical attention he brought to every question that arrived on his farm, with implications for how he responded. And the implication Gerald was working through was not whether to be honest with Stan Merritt about the January legal pad and the investor relations document and the 7-year cost differential, because honesty was not a variable in Gerald Crouch's accounting, but whether Stan Merritt was coming to his farm on Thursday morning with the genuine openness of a man who wants to understand something or the strategic openness of a man who wants to recover something. And the difference between those two things was going to determine what Thursday morning produced, and Gerald intended to know which one it was before the conversation had gone very far.
Stan Merritt arrived at Gerald's farm on Thursday morning at 8:58, 2 minutes before the 9 o'clock he had committed to, and the 2 minutes early told Gerald something about Stan that the phone call had not told him, which was that Stan was a man who respected the time of the person he was visiting enough to arrive before it rather than at it or after it, and Gerald noted this the way he noted everything that was relevant to an accurate assessment of the person he was dealing with, filed it in the column of things that counted in Stan's favor without letting it outweigh the things he did not yet know. And Gerald met Stan at the driveway and they shook hands, and Gerald looked at Stan Merritt for the first time in the 3 years since they had last seen each other at a county farm bureau meeting in 2017, and found a man who looked like what he was, which was a 54-year-old equipment dealer who had built his business over 26 years through the combination of mechanical knowledge and customer relationships that successful rural dealerships require, and who was carrying in his expression this Thursday morning the specific combination of professional composure and personal discomfort that a man carries when he is about to have a conversation he knows is necessary and does not know how it is going to go. And Gerald said, "Come inside." And they went to the kitchen, and Gerald made coffee, and they sat at the table, and Stan put a folder on the table that Gerald looked at and did not open, and Stan said, "Gerald, I'm going to be direct with you." And Gerald said, "I'd appreciate that." And Stan said, "I've lost 7 accounts in the southern part of the county in the last 14 months, and the defection pattern centers on your farm and your transition to Case IH in the spring of 2019. And Gerald said, "I know." And Stan said, "You know." And Gerald said, "Lester Dunn told me he talked to Walt Higgins, and 2 others told me they were considering the switch. I assumed the numbers were showing up in your data by now." And Stan said, 7 accounts, Gerald, in 14 months, representing about $4.2 million in equipment purchasing over the next 5 years at historical rates. And Gerald said, "I'm not surprised by the number." And Stan said, "Can you help me understand what happened?" And Gerald said, "What do you mean?" And Stan said, I mean, I've been selling John Deere equipment in this county for 26 years, and I've lost customers before, and I've always understood why, pricing or service or a specific incident. And what I'm looking at in this cluster doesn't fit any of those categories because your service history with my dealership was good, and my pricing was competitive, and there was no specific incident between you and my operation that I'm aware of. And Gerald looked at Stan and said, there wasn't. And Stan said, then help me understand. And Gerald got up and went to his office and came back with the January legal pad and the investor relations document and set them on the table in front of Stan the way he had set them in front of Lester Dunn 10 months earlier, and said, start with the third column on the legal pad and then read the investor document. And Stan looked at the documents and looked at Gerald and picked up the legal pad and read it, and then read the investor document. And Gerald watched Stan read with the patient attention of a man who has given someone something important to read and is waiting to see whether they read it the way important things deserve to be read, which is completely and without rushing toward a conclusion.
And Stan read completely and without rushing, and when he finished, he set the investor document on the table and looked at the numbers in the third column for a long moment and said, this is from our investor relations site? And Gerald said, downloaded November 2018. And Stan said, and the cost differential in the third column? And Gerald said, is the operational implication of the strategic direction the document describes over a 7-year equipment ownership period for a farm this size. And Stan said, you built this in January 2019? And Gerald said, I'd been assembling the inputs for 18 months before that. And Stan said, Gerald, most of my customers don't read investor relations documents. And Gerald said, most of your customers don't need to, Stan. But the ones who do and who understand what they're reading are going to make the decision the numbers support, and they're going to tell their neighbors why, and their neighbors are going to make the same decision if they run the same accounting. And Stan looked at the third column and said, the differential is significant. And Gerald said, it's the number I showed Lester Dunn and 2 others, yes. And Stan said, and they ran their own accountings? And Gerald said, they're farmers, Stan. Running accountings is what farmers do. And Stan was quiet for a moment and then said something that Gerald had not expected him to say, which was, is he right? And Gerald said, who? And Stan said, John Deere. Is the strategic direction in this document the direction they're actually going? And Gerald said, they've been executing against it consistently since 2018. Everything I've seen in the 2 years since I downloaded that document has confirmed the direction. And Stan said, and Case IH? And Gerald said, Walt Higgins runs an open platform. My agronomist integrates directly. My independent mechanic has full diagnostic access. My data belongs to my operation and not to a subscription architecture. And Stan said, and your yields? And Gerald said, 2.18.4 in 2019, 2.21.1 in 2020. On the same ground, I was averaging 211 with John Deere equipment. And Stan said, 6 to 10 bushels per acre improvement? And Gerald said, the yield improvement is the data quality, Stan, not the equipment brand. The equipment is good, but the yield improvement comes from what the open data architecture allows my agronomist to do with the variability mapping that he couldn't do with the filtered output from the John Deere platform. And Stan sat with that for a long time and looked at the folder he had brought and opened it and slid a document across the table to Gerald and said, I want to show you something. And Gerald looked at the document, which was Stan's dealership service revenue breakdown by customer category. And Stan said, 42% of my service revenue in 2019 came from the precision agriculture subscription and data management services that John Deere's platform requires. And Gerald looked at the number and looked at Stan and said, I know. And Stan said, you knew that when you switched. And Gerald said, I knew that was the direction, yes, that's in the investor document, Stan. The service revenue transition from mechanical to digital is explicitly described as a strategic priority. And Stan said, and you understood that my dealership's revenue model was going to shift with it. And Gerald said, I understood that the cost that shift represents for your customers was going to land on farmers and not on dealers. And Stan looked at him and said, Gerald, I'm not sure whether to be impressed or unsettled by how far ahead of this you were. And Gerald said, I was 18 months ahead of it, Stan. That's not far ahead. That's just reading what the company told its investors and doing the arithmetic. And Stan said, most people don't do the arithmetic.
And Gerald said, "Then most people are going to be surprised by the number in the third column when it arrives in their operating costs." And Stan closed the folder and looked at the January legal pad and said, "What do I do with this?" And the question landed on the kitchen table with the specific quality of a question that is genuinely open, not rhetorical and not strategic, but the honest question of a man who has read something that has changed what he understood and does not yet know what the changed understanding requires of him.
Gerald looked at Stan Merritt across the kitchen table and considered the question that Stan had just put on it, which was, "What do I do with this?" And Gerald considered it the way he considered every question that arrived with genuine openness behind it, which was seriously and without the dismissiveness that genuine openness does not deserve. And then he said, "Stan, what do you want your dealership to be in 7 years?" And Stan said, "What do you mean?" And Gerald said, "The investor document describes a direction. The direction has implications for your revenue model and your customer relationships and your operational identity as a dealership. You've read the document and you've seen the third column and you understand the arithmetic. So the question I'm asking is what you want your dealership to be when the direction the document describes has fully arrived." And Stan looked at him and said, "I want it to be what it's been for 26 years, which is the place farmers in this county come when they need equipment and service they can trust." And Gerald said, "Then the question you need to answer is whether the platform you're selling in 7 years makes that possible, or whether the platform's architecture puts you in the position of being the delivery mechanism for a cost structure that works against the farmers you've been serving for 26 years. And Stan was quiet for a long time, and Gerald let him be quiet because the question deserved the silence that thinking requires, and Gerald was not a man who filled silence with words when silence was doing more useful work than words could do. And outside, the April morning was doing what April mornings do in Champaign County, Illinois, which was carrying in the air the specific combination of soil smell and warming temperature that tells a farmer that the season is arriving and that the work of the season is going to begin requiring his full attention soon. And Stan said, "You're asking me to question my manufacturer relationship." And Gerald said, "I'm answering the question you asked me, Stan. You asked what you do with this, and what you do with it starts with understanding what your dealership is for and whether the direction your manufacturer is going serves that purpose or works against it." And Stan said, "I've been a John Deere dealer for 26 years, Gerald. That's not a relationship I can evaluate on a Thursday morning." And Gerald said, "I'm not asking you to evaluate it on a Thursday morning. I'm asking you to read the third column honestly and decide whether the number it contains is a number you want to be responsible for delivering to your customers over the next 7 years." And Stan looked at the legal pad and the third column and said, "It's a significant number." And Gerald said, "It's the number your customers are going to see in their operating costs, whether you evaluate your manufacturer relationship or not. The only question is whether they see it coming the way I saw it coming, or whether it arrives as a surprise the way surprises arrive, which is after the decision that created them is too far in the past to revisit." And Stan picked up the legal pad and looked at the third column for the third time that morning and set it down and said, "Gerald, I came here this morning thinking I was going to understand why I lost 7 accounts and find a way to recover them." And Gerald said, "I know." And Stan said, "That's not what happened." And Gerald said, "No." And Stan said, "What happened is I read something I should have read in 2018, and I'm sitting in the kitchen of a farmer who read it then and understood it then and made a decision that I'm now 4 years behind." And Gerald said, 2 years behind. "I downloaded the document in November 2018, and you're sitting here in April 2020. And Stan said, 2 years. And Gerald said, 2 years is recoverable if you use them correctly. And Stan said, "What does correctly look like?" And Gerald said, "It looks like a dealer who understands what his manufacturer's strategic direction means for his customers and who builds his service operation around what his customers actually need rather than around what the platform's subscription architecture requires them to purchase." And Stan said, "And if John Deere's direction makes that impossible?" And Gerald said, "Then you answer the question I asked you at the beginning of this conversation, which is what do you want your dealership to be in 7 years? And Stan sat with that for a long moment and then did something Gerald had not expected, which was laugh. Not the loud, performative laugh of a man deflecting from discomfort, but the quiet, genuine laugh of a man who has just seen something clearly that he had not seen before, and whose response to seeing it clearly is the specific amusement of a person who recognizes the gap between where he thought he was and where the conversation has taken him. And Stan said, "I drove out here this morning to recover 7 accounts, and you've given me a question that's going to take me 6 months to answer." And Gerald said, "The 7 accounts are not recoverable, Stan. Those farmers ran the accounting and made their decisions, and they're not going to unmake them." And Stan said, "I know that now."
And Gerald said, "But the farmers who haven't run the accounting yet are still your customers, and they're going to run it eventually because the costs are going to make them run it. And the question is whether they run it with a dealer who has already read the third column and built his operation around what it says, or with a dealer who is still figuring out what it means." And Stan looked at him and said, "You're telling me the 7 accounts I lost are less important than the 40 I still have?" And Gerald said, "I'm telling you the 40 you still have deserve a dealer who has done the same reading they're going to do, and who is prepared to have an honest conversation about what it says." And Stan picked up the investor relations document and folded it and put it in his jacket pocket and said, "Can I keep this?" And Gerald said, "I'll print you another copy. I've read that one enough times that I know where everything is," and went to his office and printed a clean copy of the investor document and brought it back and set it on the table. And Stan picked it up and put it with the folded copy in his jacket and stood up and said, "Gerald, I want to ask you one more thing." And Gerald said, "Go ahead." And Stan said, "If I come back in 6 months with an answer to your question, will you talk to me?" And Gerald looked at him and said, "Stan, I'll talk to anyone who has read the document and done the arithmetic and is asking an honest question. That's always been true, and it's still true." And Stan nodded and picked up his folder and walked to the door and stopped and said, "The 7 farmers, did you tell them to switch?" And Gerald said, "I showed them the legal pad and the investor document when they asked me why I switched, and I let them run their own accountings." And Stan said, "You never told them what to do." And Gerald said, "It's not my place to tell a neighbor what to do with his equipment decision, Stan. It's my place to answer an honest question honestly." And Stan said, "That's what cost me 7 accounts." And Gerald said, "That's what informed 7 farmers, Stan. Does a difference." And Stan looked at him for a moment with the expression of a man absorbing a distinction that is both uncomfortable and completely accurate. And then he walked to his truck and drove down Gerald's driveway and turned onto the county road toward Urbana.
And Gerald stood at the kitchen window and watched him go, and then went to his equipment shed and started his Case IH Magnum and drove it out into the April morning and began the field work that the season was asking for. And 6 months later, in October of 2020, Stan Merritt drove back to Gerald's farm on a Tuesday afternoon and sat at the kitchen table with an answer to the question Gerald had asked him in April. An answer that had taken him through a difficult internal evaluation of his dealership's direction and a difficult external conversation with his John Deere regional representative and a difficult personal reckoning with 26 years of manufacturer loyalty and what that loyalty had and had not required of him in terms of honest service to the farmers who had been his customers across those years. And the answer Stan brought to the October kitchen table was not a decision to leave John Deere, and not a decision to stay with John Deere unchanged, but something more difficult and more honest than either of those cleaner options, which was a commitment to build his service operation around what the third column said his customers were going to need, whether the manufacturer's platform made it easy or not. And Gerald listened to the answer and nodded and said, "That's an honest answer, Stan." And Stan said, "It's the only one I could arrive at that I could defend to the farmers I've been serving for 26 years. And Gerald said, "Then defend it to them the same way I showed you the legal pad, directly and completely, and without telling them what to conclude." And Stan said, "I will." And they sat at the kitchen table in the October afternoon and talked for 2 hours about what honest service to a farming community required of a dealer who had read the third column and understood what it said. And Aaron came in from the fields at 5 and found his father and Stan Merritt at the kitchen table and looked at Gerald with the question that Gerald answered with the specific expression that Aaron had learned to read across 29 years, which was the expression of a man whose accounting has produced a correct outcome and who was allowing the outcome to speak for itself without adding anything to it. And Aaron made himself coffee and sat down and joined the conversation. And outside, the Champaign County fields were finishing their second Case IH harvest, the yield maps accumulating in the open platform that Gerald's agronomist accessed without a subscription and that Gerald's independent mechanic serviced without a compliance flag.
And the 7-year horizon that the January 2019 legal pad had established was 5 years from completion, and the third column's number was arriving in operating costs across the county exactly as the accounting had said it would arrive, on schedule and without surprise for the farmers who had read the document and done the arithmetic, which was the only preparation the situation had ever required and the only preparation that Gerald Crouch had ever offered anyone who asked him why he sold his last John Deere and bought one Case IH on a Thursday morning in the spring of 2019.